Hello and welcome to the section on variable and constants. Let's look at the section objectives. After completing this section, you will be able to define variables and constants. And in this section, we're going to do a quick intro to string, integer, data type, and functions. Remember that we have a separate topic to talk about data types and also on the functions where we'll deep down into this topic. But to understand variables and constants, we're going to use some of the string and data types and functions to understand the concepts of variable. So we'll do a quick intro to understand this concept as well. Then we'll look at differences between variable and constants, how to define them, how to use them, and what are the differences. Then we'll understand different types of variable scopes, predefined variable, variables of variable, and magic constants. Then we'll work with the exercise, interview question, resource, and practical test. So these are the topics we're going to cover into this section. Okay, so let's jump into the section now. Okay, so before you start defining a variable, there are some terms I want you to understand. And this is the language that we use to define a variable. Okay, so if you look at the code here, there's a PHP code. The first thing that you see is the variable name. The variable name is always on the left hand side. The variables are never on the right hand side. Okay, they're always on the left hand side and they start with this symbol called as $. Okay. Dollar some name is called as a variable name and it's always on the left hand side. The right hand side is called as variable value. Whatever that value that you're assigning to a variable is called as variable value, and this variable value can be the string, could be an integer, could be a boolean value. So the things that you want to hold it into a variable is called as variable name. So in terms, how do you read this? Message is a variable name having a variable value of a hello variables. So that's how you read it as a sentence. To understand how do you read this, you have to understand what is a variable name, what is a variable value, and where is the variable name. It is on the left hand side. And how do you know it's a variable? You know because there is a $sign. So to define a variable, you need to have a $sign in front. Okay, I'll read it one more time just to make sure you understand it. Message is a variable name. Message variable actually has a variable value which is hello variables. Okay, and all these are called as assignment statement. Means you are assigning a value to a variable. This is called as a statement, and this type of statement is called as assignment statements. We're going to look into statements in the next section. So when we define the variables, we'll be using this term so we get used to these new words. And also it will help you to explain your code to somebody else. Okay, so let's create some variables now and look into the next section. Okay, so let's define our variable now. So if you go to the material folder, variable and constants, open this folder, go to example 1, define a variable, and here you have before and an after file. Okay, so before file name basically have before as in file name, that indicates it's a file that you have to start with, and after file will not have that value. Okay, so let's open the files. So I hope by now you know what is the pattern of having the logical flow and the deliverables, and I'll keep attaching the homeworks here which you can go ahead and practice. I'll show you in the last what is the homework. So we have opened two files, deliverables and logical flow. So we'll create two files, define variable 1 and define variable 2. Then in the logical flow you have define a variable. That's what we're going to learn, how to define a variable. Then we will change the variable value. Okay, so for that we will open the before folder file. Okay, and then we're going to create the file. So I'll say Control N, Control S, Control V. So before that we need to have a folder. So let's quickly go ahead and create that folder. So I'm in the amps ww folder. Previously we have created language folder. Now I will create another folder for variables. Okay, and we will save the file in this folder. Okay, I'm going to save the file in this folder. Right, and I'm copy and paste the HTML code. So now you can start with this. Okay, the first example is to define a variable. Okay, so I'm gonna say sample1. Let's create the opening and the closing tag. Then I'm gonna create a variable called about me. Okay, and how to define a variable? You need to have a dollar sign and some of the name that you can assign to a variable. Then you can attach the variable value to a variable. Okay, and when it's a double quote, it indicates it's a string. When there's no string and when you write numbers, it's an integer. Okay, we're going to look into that next section, but as of now, treat this as a string with double quotes. You can use double quotes and single quote, doesn't really matter. So use as of now a single quote and consider this as a string. Okay, so I'm saying I am Srini and I love programming. Okay, so I've defined a variable and I want to print this variable. So you can, so before that I will print some HTML tags, h1. I'll say about me and just say dollar about me. As simple as that, right? Is it defining a variable? Right, I can write the comment here. And this is printing the variable. Okay, so let's quickly view this file. So if you head back to browser, localhost variables slash our file name define variable 1.php. Okay, so there we go. You have the text here, and this text is coming up from our variable dollar about me. Remember, when you want to define a variable, it should start with dollar. If you remove the dollar, it won't able to recognize this as a variable. Okay, so that's our first example of defining a variable. Let's change the variable value and redisplay it. So for that, I'm going to create new file. Copy the previous code. Let's look at another sample. Now I'm going to change the value of about me. Because it's a variable, you can change the value n number of times. So I'll say text is changed to PHP now. Okay, some text, and I will print the variable. Okay, so one thing I want you to understand is if it's a variable, you can change the text n number of times. Okay, and you can print this variable. You don't have to redefine anything, right? You're not defining about me one time and then you're changing the value. You're just doing the same thing again and again, and it's going to define and change the value. Okay, let's look into that. I opened up the second file and it says text is changed to PHP now. Okay, very simple example of how to define a variable and how to change the variable value. Well, that's a very simple example on how to define a variable and how to print a variable, how to change the variable value. Okay, all right, that's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the lecture on string and integers. This is basically a quick intro on string and integer. There's a separate section on data type wherein we're going to deep down into strings and integers, boolean and other data types. But for now, to understand variable, you need to at least have a basic knowledge on what is a string and what is an integer and how to print them. So for that, we will cover this topic of string and integer in this section. Okay, so if you go to the material folder, string and integer example, you will find the deliverable and the logical flow. So part of this lecture, we're going to create 3 files, and the 3 files basically have define a string and integer variable. We'll define string and integer, and then we're going to print them. Then we'll display string and variable together in one line. Then we'll add 2 numbers with integer variable. We'll do some add operation on the integer variables. Okay, so let's quickly do that. So I'm going to use the same folder, variables folder, and I'm going to create all the files here. So copying this file name, new saving it, make sure it is in the variables, paste it in the file name, say save. Okay, and if you go to the folder here, you have a before folder. So every time you have a before folder, make sure the file is open up, and then you verify what is the code inside it. So this is basically a starting point for us to start writing the program. Okay, so now we have the HTML code ready, so we can start understanding how to use strings. So first let's define a variable of type string. Okay, so I'll say name John Smith, and I'm gonna have a message for him. If it's a double quotes or single quotes, then it is considered as a string variable. So you can say message is a string variable. And how to define a variable? You use a $sign. And how do you print two variables? Okay, you can say echo $name, and you want to print message in the same line. You use an operator called as dot. Dot is an operator to combine variables and strings together. It could be integers as well, and then you say message. Okay, so now you will see name and message as a value, but before that we want to have dummy text to separate the two variables. Okay, now you will have name John Smith : and the message. Okay, so let's verify this, and as we go along we type more. Okay, so we have John Smith, this is a string message. So now we are printing two variables, right, in the same line using the dot notation. If you want to print the same thing on a string, you can use double quotes, and then you can remove all the dots. Okay, I'm doing the same thing, and here I can add br. Okay, let's refresh this. Right, you have the same string. This time I'm using double quotes, and I'm using the variable inside the double quotes. Means you can even print a variable inside the double quotes. Well, you might be confused how PHP understand this is not a string but it's a variable. That's the value coming up from the $sign. The $sign is telling the PHP this is a variable, so fetch the value and print the variable. If there is no $sign, then it actually becomes a text. Let me show you that. So it becomes a name, but once you add a $sign, it becomes a variable. So now I try to fetch the data of that variable. Okay, let's similarly print an integer. So we're gonna say, let's add some heading here. Then we'll say now we'll say version of the PHP is 7.0. Let's try to print this variable. So I'll say echo version is, I can directly say version here. So one thing is, the variable need not have to be a string only. It could be any type, as long as it has $sign and it is a variable that is defined and has some value, it will print it. So let's verify this. So now you have two headings, and then you have this PHP version is 7. All right, let's try to change it to 7.3, and you can able to see 7.3. right? So it's very simple to work with integers and strings as a variable, and then you can assign string with double quotes or single quotes, and you can assign the integer values as it is to the variable, and then you can use the variable to print with the echo inside the double quotes or using the dot notation. Okay, so let's look at the next example. The next example is displaying them together. Okay, so let's display them together. I'm going to copy paste this. Let's do a sample 2. So let's combine them, and then you'll see the power of PHP. So we have seen this $name : message. You can even say name : $name. You can even say $language PHP, then echo. Right, so you're actually writing, you're writing English language, right? You're just reading it out as an English. The language version is the version value, right? So it's easy to see the power of PHP when you say you can attach strings, you can attach integers together. It doesn't really matter, it just understands everything. You can even, if you want to split this up, you can say dot and dot. It doesn't really matter whether you're using an integer to a string or string to an integer. It doesn't really care how you're writing it. Just you have to say what notation you're using. I'm using a dot to attach it, and then dollar to specify it's a variable. Okay, so let's quickly run this, and we should say combine strings. You should see the name and the value, the name. You can do this. You can attach the new lines, right? Then you have a string message, you have name John Smith, a string, and you have also attached an integer to it. So that's how you basically play around with strings and integers. So let's look at the last example. The last example is to add 2 numbers. So I'm going to add 2 integers. Use the same example. Example 3. Here I'm going to have first value is equal to 10. Second value is equal to 20. Then I'm going to have a total. First value plus second value. We're going to look at the operators later, plus operator, right? So as of now, just imagine we are trying to add 2 values. Okay, then we are going to print total well, that's the example of having a first variable, integer variable, second integer variable. I'll rename this to second, right? Yeah. Then you have attaching this to a total, and then you have a total variable. Okay, then printing the total, and we're going to attach heading to it, and we'll say add 2 values, right? Let's quickly run through this. Okay, so the addition is here. So it's very simple to work with integers and strings. This is basically a very quick intro on strings and integers. We're going to deep down into integers and look into different values, plus values, minus values, what is the range of integers, and all those things in the next section. Okay, so that's all for this lecture, and I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the lecture on variable declaration. Let's look at the lecture objectives. After completing this lecture, you will be able to understand how to use correct names for your variables. So let's see some of the rules that you need to follow when defining your variables. So let's look at the rules now. The first rule is the variable name should start with $sign. So we have seen this example wherein when you put a $sign in front of the variable name and then you use that in the double quotes to print the message, then it's able to recognize it as a variable. So all the variable should start with $sign. The next rule is when you define your variable name, right after the dollar, the character should be an alphabet or it should be an underscore character. You cannot use numbers nor you cannot use special characters right after the dollar. After dollar, let's say you put any alphabet, after that you can actually use the numbers. The next rule says the variable name cannot have space. The example is $user underscore name. That's basically two words, user and a name, and you have to differentiate with an underscore. You cannot say $user and some space and some name. You cannot define variable name like that. And apart from underscore, you actually cannot use any other special characters like percentage, hyphen, plus. You cannot use that because it has separate meaning in PHP. So don't use those characters in your variable names. Variable names are case sensitive. We're going to have a separate lecture on it to understand why variables are case sensitive and why some of the methods in PHP are not case sensitives. Okay, so if you could take an example, the $user underscore name is different from $ucaps user underscore name. You should use the same case that you're used to define and use it. The next rule is a good practice. It's not a mandatory, but it's a good practice not to use variable name as keyword or reserve words. Well, we have seen keywords and reserve words previously. So don't use those words as a variable name. Even though it works because you're assigning dollar to it, but it's not a good practice to use the keyword names as a variable names. You no need to initialize the variable with default values. You have seen previously when we created $message, $name, we never created $name and then assigned it later. We then and there define the variable and assign the value. So there's no need to initialize like other programming language if you have coming from C or Java, where you have to define your variable first. Here you don't need to define any variable, no need to initialize any default value for the variable. Last, you can assign integer to string and string to integer variable. We're going to look into this lecture separately, wherein we're going to play around with converting string to integer and integer to string in the variable typing lecture. Okay, so that's basically some of the rules and good practices that you can follow to create your variables. So let's look at some of these examples in the code itself. Well, this is the lecture summary. By now you should be able to understand how to use correct names for your variables. Okay, so that's it for the lecture. I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the lecture on single quote versus double quotes. So in this exercise, we're going to understand what is the difference between using single quote and double quotes and when to use them. Okay, so if you go to the material folder, you have a deliverables file and then you have logical flow. So part of this, we will create one file and then we'll understand when to use single quotes and when to use double quotes, and we'll keep the concepts back to variables. So let's go ahead and create this file. I'm saying Control New, Control S, and I'll use a variables folder. Inside this, I'm going to save this file. Okay, let me put some text there. And let's try to print this variable in the echo. So I'll say printing the message variable, and now you can embed message in the double quotes. So what happens if I convert this into a single quote, right? That's what we are trying to understand. Okay, so let's verify this output. So we have a message variable and we are trying to print the message variable using double quotes and single quotes. Okay, so let's print this output and verify what happens. Variables folder and go to your file name. Okay, you can see it's printing the first time. Second time it just print the variable. Interesting, right? So let's add some breaks to make it more visible. and then we're going to verify the code. Yeah. So when you use single quotes, your message variable remains the same. Means it doesn't really look into the variable and say, okay, I have to put this value into at the place of the variable. It just treat everything as a text. Whereas in double quotes, it basically check for this variable symbol and then convert that symbol into a text, right? So whenever you want to print a variable, you have to use double quotes. That's the rule. Okay. Let's go ahead and do some more changes to our message and say I have message 2. If you want to print two variables, you can say echo double quotes $message and $message 2. Right, you can use n number of variables, it doesn't really matter. Okay, let me add the breakpoints. And it basically prints both of the variables. Okay, let's do one more final test. If you have message, you can even use dot notation. This time let's use single quote and see what happens, and use message 2. Okay, so you see there, the single quote, it doesn't really print. That's basically the message I want you to convey. If you want to print a variable, always use double quotes. Okay, don't use single quotes, and you can attach n number of variables in a double quotes. Okay, and you can even use dot notation to attach multiple strings. Okay, so that's all for this lecture, and I hope you understood when to use double quote and single quotes and how it actually behaves. Okay, I'll see you in the next lecture. Welcome to the lecture on variable typing. In this lecture, you're gonna see how the variable typing works with PHP. When I say variable typing, how the conversion of string to integer and different data types, because we haven't covered all the data types, so we'll look into string and integer, which we have already covered, and we'll try to understand these concepts of variable typing, wherein how PHP actually converts integer to string and string to integer. Okay, so if you go to the material folder, go to example 5, you have your datables file. We'll create 3 files, and these are logical flow. The first file, what we'll do, we'll define 2 integers, length and breadth, and we'll print the area. That's the typing one. Then we'll define 1 string, 1 integer, and print the area. Okay, we'll convert that 1 integer to string. Then we'll use 2 string characters, not the integer, but we'll try to use some characters, and then we'll try to print them and see how it actually behaves. Okay, so let's quickly do that exercise. So I'm gonna copy the file name, new, save. Okay, so let's go ahead and create that file. So I'll call this sample 1, where you have length field, breadth variable, and you're calculating an area. Okay, very simple and straightforward, right? The standard method of printing 2 integers. Okay, let's quickly do this and then we'll enhance this program. Right, let's create another sample. Okay, so let's save this file. I'm going to create one more file so that you have a reference of where we started, and we'll enhance the program. Okay, I just copied the code and I renamed the file to variable typing 2. So here we will try to use the typing concept. So I'll say everything remains the same, so I'll copy this so that we can save some time, and I'll convert this into string. right? And the best part of PHP is, even though it is trying to multiply needs integers, right? Even though it's string, it converts into an integer and then help us to do that operation. So we don't have to worry about converting a string to integer or integers to string. Okay, so let's quickly verify this. Okay, it's still print 200. Let's quickly create the third example. And let's play around with this. Okay, I know if I make it string it will work, but what happens if I do this? That's interesting to know, right? But sometimes when you're trying to define a variable and you imagine it's integer but it is not an integer, so what typically happens? Okay, so I created this length and breadth. Okay, it will error out. So you should need to know this. Typing is good, typing you can play around with it, but remember that typing is bad also, because if you are not aware of that value at that runtime, it will error out. Okay, so you need to know whatever operation you are doing, that value has an integer, and you assume it is a string and has an integer, and sometimes it doesn't have an integer, you will run into errors. So be careful with typing. So make sure before you apply any of the integer operations like plus, minus, addition, divisions, those kind of operations, make sure those variables are integer variables. If you're using string, that's fine, but make sure those variables are already having some integers. Okay, don't try to multiply string with a string or integer with a string. Okay, it will still error out, right? So don't do this kind of operations and try to be careful with the variable typing. Okay, alright, so that's all for this lecture. I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the lecture on functions. So if you go to the materials and variable and constants, go to functions folder. This is a quick intro, so I'll not go details into functions. So there is a separate section on functions where we'll deep down into function and understand different types of function and how to write functions, because we'll be using some of the examples to show variable concept and constant concept using functions. So we are doing a quick intro on it. So if you go to the functions folder, there's a derivative here, and then you have the logical flow file. Open this up. So let's open logical flow and the deliverables file. Okay, so let's verify this. So part of this deliverable, we'll create 3 files. The first one will define a function and call it. Second, we'll understand how the duplicate functions will work. And third one, we'll see the sequence of the functions. Okay, so we'll quickly run through the functions concept. Again, this is a quick intro. When you go to function section, we're going to deep down into function and understand all the details of the functions. Okay, so let's quickly write about functions. So if you're hearing functions for the first time, it's also called as methods. If you have a piece of code which is duplicated in your program, you create it as a function and you call it multiple times. Okay, so it helps us reduce your number of lines in the code. So let's do a sample one, and let's define a function. To define a function, you have to use the keyword called function, okay, followed by a function name. Let's say you're defining an add function, so you can say add as a function name, then you open and close the parenthesis. Okay, then you create the block of the function. So in this block, all your function code will lies, and after the block, the function will be completed. So here we will try to define the function body. Okay, so this is called as function declaration, and this is called as function body. So whatever you will write here will be executed when you call this function. So I'll show you how to call a function as well. So let's define a variable first, value, then we'll do some total, class, because there is an addition, so we are adding two variables. Anyway, we are not passing it, we're just creating it here and then returning it to the total, and then we're going to print it here itself. Okay, so how to call this function? To call this function, you just have to say the name of the function and open and close parentheses. Okay, this is basically called as calling the function. Okay, so let's verify this one. Okay, you get the 30. This basically the function is calling the add method. Okay, so let's go ahead and create another file. Copy this. Okay, so I'm going to create sample2. Here I'm going to try to duplicate the function and see what happens. Okay, so we define a function add again, and we'll say duplicate function. I just want to show you what happens if you create a duplicate function. Okay, obviously it error out, so you cannot have same function name twice defined in the same file. Okay, that's an example for you to remember. So let's create one more file, and this time we will see the sequence of the function. So copy this, paste it here, and I'm going to comment this out. So what I want to do, I want to call a function first. Let's say welcome message. Okay, and then I want to define it. Okay, so even though you define the sequence as first you call the function, then you define the function, let's see what happens, whether it can find that function or not. Right, so let's execute this, and it has no problem executing. So functions sequence doesn't really matter, right? You write it on top, you write it on bottom, you call it first, then you define it, or anyway it's fine. So even though you're defining the function after you're calling, it's able to call that function. Okay, and then you cannot have duplicate names, means if you have same function name twice, it'll error out. How to call a function? You have to add the function name, that's the add function name, and then you have to add the parenthesis. To define a function, you have to use a keyword called function, the function name, two parentheses, and the block. Okay, so that's all about the function. I hope it's very clear. So we're going to use functions going forward as of now, and we'll try to use some concepts to define variables. Okay, so that's all for this lecture. I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the lecture on PHP case sensitivity. So here we'll understand what is case sensitive in PHP. We looked in this case sensitive previously with variables. Now we know how to create a function, and we will also look into how PHP behaves when you try to use the same thing in lowercase and uppercase. Okay, so part of this, go to example 7, PHP is case sensitive. We'll create one file and we'll define some examples in it to see what is case sensitive in PHP. Okay, so let's understand this. So Control S, Control V. Okay, what happens if I say PHP in caps? Okay, that's the first thing I want to try. What happens? Okay, and I'll try to use echo in different caps. And completely caps. Will it complain or will it not complain? That's basically we're trying to understand here. What is the case sensitivity of PHP? So if you go to language for variables folder, and it doesn't really complain. Yeah, this is basically PHP. Not everything is case sensitive. You can define the functions, you can define the tags in upper or lower case. It doesn't really care. That's why it's called as loosely typed. Sometimes PHP is called as loosely typed. That's the reason. One of the reason is you doesn't really matter whether it is lower case or upper case. It's just able to print this as per is required. Okay, you can even try to use print, and it should able to print that as well, right? So let's look at variables. Variables as case sensitive. So let's define a name, call it PHP, right? And then we'll define another name. Let's say I call it my name. Okay, let's do an echo. So it's able to print both the variables. It doesn't really complain, you know, there's a case differences here, and it actually treats both the variables differently. Means if you have a different name with different caps, then it treats that as a new variable. Okay, and you cannot say like this, right? It doesn't know what is that variable, because variables are case sensitive. That's what we are trying to show here. So be careful with the variable namings, because variables are case sensitive. Okay, so let's try out with function. We'll print a message. So let's understand whether functions are case sensitive or not. Okay, and I tried to print this. And let's see what happens. It doesn't really care, right? It doesn't really care whether your functions are basically uppercase or lowercase. And what happens if you create a duplicate out of it? Because it doesn't care, it will be able to find the duplicate, right? It will error out because you're creating a duplicate. You have to understand from function that function are not case sensitive. Means the function names that you have are not case sensitive. Means you can create any name that you want and call it with any case that you have, but you cannot have duplicate by changing the case. Okay, so I hope it's clear. I'll comment this out. Well, PHP is not case sensitive for the functions and the keywords, but it is case sensitive for the variables. Okay, so that's all for this lecture, and I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the lecture on local variables. So if you go to the material folder, variable and constants, go to example 8, open up the logical flow and the deliverables. So we'll understand how the variable behaves inside the function and outside the function. So this will help you understand the concept of local variables. Local variables are the variables that is defined outside the functions, and how it will vary the scope, and also what is the value of that variable inside the functions. So we'll understand two concepts here. Understand local variable concept first, then we'll learn about scope of the variable using functions. Okay, part of that we'll prepare this two files. So let's go ahead and create this. Okay, so I have created Control N, save the file, and Control S. I'll call this as sample1, and I'll create a variable. I'll define a function to print that name, and I'll change that value PHP, and I'll try to print that name. Okay, then I'll say print underscore name, and I'll say echo $name. So what do you think the output is? So what we have done is we have defined one variable name. Inside the function there's another variable called name. We are printing that variable. Then we'll try to print that variable, and then echo, using echo we'll print a $name variable. So what do you think? After the function has been executed, the value of the variable name is changed to PHP, or it will return to Srini. Let's verify this. So I'll copy the file name. Okay, so if you see it here, it has PHP for the first time, that's basically this variable. Then it has Srini, that's basically this variable. So this is basically called as variable scope. The scope of $name is outside the function, and when you redefine the same variable with a different value inside the function, the variable will die after the function has been completed. Means after the function has been executed, the outside code doesn't understand what is the $name variable. So it's know the $name is variable defined outside, and it has a value of Srini. So the function doesn't really change the variable name, because the scope of the $name inside the function retains inside the function itself. Once it comes out, this variable is killed. Means it has no scope outside this function. Okay, so let's understand one more concept in variable scope. Let's create one more file. This time we'll understand the scope of variable using functions. I've created the file too. Copy this. I will call it sample2. This time we will have a message to say welcome to PHP, and we'll write a function to display it, print message, and we will try to echo the message, and then we'll print the message. So can you guess what happens when you try to print a message of a variable that is not defined inside the function but is defined outside the function? So another way is, can the functions access variable that is defined outside the function? What do you think is the output? Make a guess, and we'll try to execute this. Well, it's unable to print anything. This PHP and Srini is actually coming up from sample1, and sample2 is unable to print that variable because it doesn't know, the function doesn't know this variable that is defined outside this function. Okay, because the scope of this variable is only limited outside the function. If you go inside any functions, it doesn't understand the variable that is defined outside the function. Okay, this is called as variable scoping. It's very important to understand, when you define a variable, you cannot access inside any function. And if you define the same variable name inside the function and use different value, it doesn't really affect the variable that is defined outside the function. Okay, very simple to understand, and you need to know how the variable works and what is the scope of a local variable. Okay, so I hope you have understood how the local variable works, and that's all for this lecture, and I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the lecture on global variables. So if you go to the variable and constant folder, go to example 9. Let's open these two files. So part of this lecture, we will create 3 examples. First, we'll define global variables and compare it with local variable. Then we'll understand what is the purpose of a global variable here. Then we'll try to replicate one error to see how a global variable will affect inside the function. Then we'll see the right way to access the global variable inside the function. So this way you will learn how to work around with global variables. So let's create these files and then we'll understand each of these concepts. So we'll create 3 samples. So I'll say sample 1 is this, and we'll try to use the same code that we have developed for local variables, and we'll try to convert it into a global variable. So we'll define a variable of type name, and we'll try to print this name. Okay, so nothing fancy. I defined a variable, defined a method to print. Let's print this variable as well in the method. Then I'm printing that variable. We have seen this example previously, so we'll start working from here. Okay, so we are able to see PHP first, then Srini. So if you have to define a global variable, what you do is you name it as a keyword called as global, and when you define a variable as global, it becomes a global variable, means it can be accessed from anywhere. And if you have to define a global variable, you have to first define it, then assign it. Okay, that's the rule of defining a global variable. So this is called as defining the global variable. This is assigning the global variable. Okay, so now the name becomes a global variable, and once the print function change that value of a global variable, let's see what happens. So this function also have a variable called name, and then we have a global variable called name. So let's see what happens when a method have its own variable name matching up with the global variable. Okay, there's no difference. Even though you have a global variable, you are not accessing via the function, right? And then whatever you are defining the variable is actually local to this function. Even though the name global is a global variable, in the function you have the same name. This variable basically is a local variable to this function, and it doesn't really affect with the global variable. So understand this concept, wherein even if you have a global variable, function has a variable same name, it will overwrite, means this variable will be created in this scope and it will die off when the function is finished executing. Okay, so let's run through in second example when we'll try to access the global variable inside the function. Okay, so let's go on and do that. Copy this code and we'll say sample 2. Here we will define another message variable, and when you define a global variable, you don't assign a value right away. You define it first, then you assign the value. Let's try to print this. And this time we will echo the message, and then we'll also call this method, and then we'll echo message. Right, pretty simple to understand. We have a global variable and we are trying to print it. Previously we created one global variable and we created another variable inside the function, so it doesn't really change the global variable. So this time we didn't do that. We just trying to access the global variable from the function. So let's see what happens, whether this function is able to access this global variable because we are not defining it, we're just trying to print it. So let's go to scope 2, and if you notice it from welcome to PHP, you should be getting welcome to PHP twice, right? Because first time is from your method, second time is the echo. So looks like your global variable, you're unable to access a global variable even though it's defined as global. So there's one rule that you have to remember: even though you define a global variable, the function cannot access that global variable. In the next example, let's try to access this message from the function. Okay, so for that I'm going to create one more file. Copy this up, we'll use it as same example, sample 3. We'll call it message 1. Okay, the only thing that you have to do is you have to mention this is a global variable. Okay, and then we'll try to print it. Okay, now you can see the welcome to PHP actually coming up from here. I'll say PHP 1. Yeah, so these two are basically coming up first from the function and then from the echo. So now we are able to access the message variable from the function because we defined as a global, and we are saying, okay, I want to use the global variable and give me the value. So what happens if I change this global variable inside the method? Okay, let's try that. So I'm trying to change the global variable inside the function. Okay, let's execute that. So you see the value is changed even after the function. So once you come out of the function, the variable still holds whatever you have set inside the method, and then it's trying to print that value. Okay, so this is a good understanding that when you have a global variable and you want to access global variable from the function, you have to redefine the same variable as with the keyword global, and then you can start using the global variable. You have to know when to use global variable keyword and how to access a global variable from the method itself. Okay, so that's all for this section on global variable, and I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the lecture on static variables. So let's go to the material folder, variable and constants, example 10, static variables. So in this lecture we're going to define a static variable and print it, and this way you'll get to know how to use a static variable and when to use the static variable. We're going to do that. So for part of that we'll create this file. Let's go to Sublime. So let's write a function called counter, and I want to print the counter. Okay, let's say counter is 1. I'll say counter count count is equal to count plus 1. We haven't covered operators yet, but it's simple to understand that if count is a variable, we are adding plus 1 to it. Okay, there's a separate section on operators where we're going to deep down into all the operators that we have for PHP, but this is a simple operator plus operator, and you can add any integer to it. Now what I want to do is I want to call this counter 5 times, and I want to see what will happen to the counter and what it will display. Okay, so let's print this counter. Okay, it's not printing 1 to 5, but it's printing all 1. This is because the $count is a local variable to this function, and whenever you recall the function, this variable will be recreated and assigned with 1. But what if you want to assign it once and you want the function to remember that variable and you want to print 1 to 5, right? So how are you going to do that? Let's copy this. And then we're going to add h1 tag. I'm going to say static variables. I'm going to call this counter static. Okay, and the keyword to use is called a static. That's all. That's the whole magic of using static. So you call this variable as static, and then we'll verify this, and you know it's 1 2 3 4 5, because when you use a static variable, the static variable will not die off when the function is finished. The static variable is still available for you to access, and whenever you are initializing a static variable, it doesn't reinitialize again. The keyword static will help the count variable not to reinitialize again. That's one of the help. And then it try to remember count, right? Because when you try to do count and count plus 1, it remember what is the previous value of count, and then it will store this value, and even the function is finished, it still holds that value. So you are still able to access that counter. Okay, so that's the one classic use case of a static variable, wherein you have a variable inside your method and you want to hold the state of that method, and whatever value that variable has, you want to re-access it and you want to use that variable for your processing. And the most common use cases is the use of the counters or use of any running numbers. Okay, so that's all for this lecture. I'm going to see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on super global variables. Super global variables are the variables that is predefined by PHP, and you can access them inside your code. So let's look at some of the predefined super global variables. So part of this lecture, we're going to create 3 deliverable files, and first one we will see how to use super global variables. Second, we will predefine some super global variables and we'll reuse it. Then we'll see how to use this super global variables to access the global variables inside the function. Just now previously we saw how to access a global variable inside a function. Now we'll try to do the same thing using the super global variables. So before we go into this exercise, let's go ahead to this URL, and this URL is php.net manual language variables.superglobalvariables. Okay, and this link I'll attach it to the description so you can get this link, and this link actually have all these super global variables. These are the variables that you don't have to define but it's readily available for you to use. So we're going to look into one of the global variables that is called as _globals. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that exercise. Creating a new file, save it, go to d:\ams ww variables. I'm gonna save this. Okay, so that's our first sample. We'll use the global super global variable called $globals. Okay, so let's define our first message, global message. This is basically a variable defined as a global. Alright, then we'll assign some message to it. To print it, we can use this super global variables. We can say globals. Inside this, we can specify the global variable name. And if you're seeing the square brackets for the first time, this is a separate section on this square bracket which is called as arrays. We're going to go in depth within arrays and understand how arrays work in a separate section. But for now, treat it as a notation of how to access your variable. You have to have a square brackets and put the variable name inside. Okay, so let's quickly verify that. Okay, so we are able to access the message variable from this $global, and if you see the code, we haven't set this variable anywhere inside this variable, but by default when you say global, it's already setting your variable in this super global variables. Okay, so let's move on to the next exercise, and that is basically predefined. Use one of the predefined super global variable. So what we'll do, we will use a predefined super global variable called $_server, and if you hit to this link, I'll provide you this link. There is this $_server super global variable already available for you to use, and we'll try to use one of the parameter of which is called as PHP self. Okay, let's do an exercise on that. Let's use the super global variable to access PHP self. And what this PHP self will does it gets you the file name of the current executing script. So you'll get you this file name. Okay, so we copy this code, we say sample2, and we'll just echo the file name, right? Then you can use the super global variables server square brackets, and then inside this you can say PHP _self. Okay, so that's all you have to do to call get the file name of this script. So let's execute that. Okay, you got the file name. That's basically super global variable 2.php. So there are other super global variables which you can use for in your scripting. Let's look at the third one. This one will try to use the super global variable to access a global variable inside the method. So this is our sample3. So I'll say same thing, global variable define name is equal to John Smith. Then we'll write a simple function to print the name. And we see previously, if you print echo $name, it doesn't really have access to global variable. You have to define it as a global and then you have to use it. But there's a good way you can, without even defining the same variable as global, you can use the super global variables. Okay, so let's access this. Okay, you see the John Smith. So you are able to access a global variable with the super global variables. There's one observation, all the other super variables actually have underscore, only the global doesn't have an underscore. This way of accessing a global variable is basically a standard. We don't really redefine every time we go ahead and do this. We typically not do this as a coding standard. What we do, we try to use the globals, super global variable, to access our global variables. Okay, so here are the three ways. One is how to define super global variables and how to use the predefined super global variable. We have used server. Then how to access global variable using this super global variables within the function. Okay, so that's all for this lecture, and I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the lecture on variable of variables. Well, this topic is super confusing to understand, but if you understand this concept very well, then it's really easy to understand and move forward and use it. So I'll go very slowly on this, and if you have any questions on how this actually works, you can post your question in the Q&A and I'll be happy to answer that. Okay, so if you go to example 12 folder, so we'll create one file and the logical flow is how to use variable of variables. So we'll understand this concept. Let's quickly create this file. So for this, let me define some variables, then I'll explain you the concept. Okay, so let's say you have two variables. One is male, that is the name John Smith, and one is a gender, which is saying it's a male, right? Male is basically a variable, right? We know that male is a variable, but gender is actually holding the variable name. So gender is holding a variable name. So we say male is a variable, gender is holding a variable name. Okay, remember that, variable name. Don't get confused with the text and the variable name. It's still a text, but it is referring to a variable name. Okay, I'll keep repeating that so that you understand what I'm trying to do here. Gender is holding a variable name, not the text. So now if I want to print male via the gender, because it is holding the variable name, I'm going to use variables of variables. So I can do, if I do gender, I actually get male as an output. And if I want to access male's value, because male is a variable, right, and gender is holding a male variable. So if I want to print male variable value, how I'm going to do it? So I'm going to use $2 and I'm going to say gender, and this $2 is something like this. It's something like this, and this $sign of gender is male. For that you are again saying a $sign, means you are saying is equal to, right? Then it will try to get the value for the male, which is John Smith. Okay, so let's comment this out and then we'll try to access this. You see the male, this male is coming up from $gender, and you see the John Smith, this is basically called as variable of variables, means $gender is a variable which is holding a value of a variable, and when you say variable of a variable, you actually get the value of a variable, that is John Smith. That's why you see a John Smith. Well, you can play around with it. Let's create three more variables. Let's say student is John Smith, and then we'll say male is equal to student. I'm going to hold the variable of a student. Then I'm going to say gender is going to holding a male variable. Now just make a wild guess how you're going to print John Smith, okay, using the gender variable. How you're going to do the variables of variables and print John Smith. So for that, the first $sign and gender will print male. The second $sign will print student. And if I do one more dollar, that's basically a student variable and the John Smith will be printed. Okay, so let's verify that. So for that, I'll just put a breakpoint here. And we can see all these things here. right? Let's refresh this. Okay, so the first gender prints male, right? The second gender is male's value, that is student. The third gender is basically your John Smith. So it's 3 level up, then we're going to reach to the John Smith, and that's what is printed here. So this concept is called as variable of variables, wherein if a variable has a value of another variable, you can use the dollar symbol to get to that variable value. Okay, so I think this concept is pretty straightforward and easy to understand. If you haven't really clear about it, I highly recommend you try this out and play around with it to understand this concept. Alright, so that's all for this lecture, and I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the lecture on predefined variables. So if you go to material, variable and constants, example 13, you can find these 3 files. Let's open the deliverables file, logical flow, and then you have this predefined variable where you can find the URL of all the predefined variables from PHP. Okay, so what we're going to do here is I want to show just one example of predefined variable, and what I want you to do is go to that URL and try to do some more examples from the predefined variables. So just a variable is all these variables are predefined and available for us to use in PHP, and whenever there's a need, typically you don't have to rewrite it. Sometimes you have to go and see what variables are available for you to use. Okay, so that's the exercise I want you to do on hands-on. Instead of me showing you all the variables, just try out some of the variables to have a feel how to read the documentation, how to find your own variables, and try to do some research around it. Okay, so first let's go and look into the URL. This URL is available in this predefined variable file, and if you go to the predefined variable, these are large number of predefined variables available to all the scripts. And one that we have seen previously is nothing but the super global variables, where we saw underscore global and underscore server. And apart from that, you have all others predefined variables, and it will be keep adding as in the new version comes up. So let's try to use one of the predefined variable, that is PHP error message, and I'll leave it you with this link, and try to go to one of the example and try to reuse and play around with it. So let's quickly create our file. Define from variable. In order to use PHP error message, you have to create an error. An error can be done by 1 divided by 0. That's an error there, right? You want to print the predefined variable, that is nothing but $PHP error message. Whatever is the error message here, it will be printed here. Okay, so for that you cannot run this code because this line itself will error out, so you will not be able to print the message. The @ symbol will suppress the error that is happening from this line, so that we can access the error message in the next line. Okay, so let's go ahead and access this file. Okay, so there's an error, divide by 0. If I remove this, you will see a different error. Okay, you see the error here, but you see the divide by error. If you want to suppress the errors, you just put @. Okay, it will suppress that. So it's showing an error that has happened previously, right? It happened in the previous line, and then you can see that error that happened in the previous line with this predefined variable. So the other predefined variables. So in this section, I want you to do some hands-on. Go ahead and try to use one of this predefined variable and super global variable, and try it yourself so that you get an access to this URL. You will try to browse through it and read some article around it, and try to use your own variables that you find interesting here. Okay, so I'll leave you with this exercise, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Welcome to the lecture on variable isSet. isSet basically is a method to check whether a variable is set or not. Okay, so in this example, if you go to the material example 14, open the logical flow, and open the deliverables. The logical flow is how to check if a variable is set, and I believe isSet is the highly used method in PHP, and you will be coming across isSet in many of the codes that you see online. Okay, so it's a good exercise that you learn about it. So let's create this file and then we will try to define and use isSet. So first we will have to define an empty variable, right? So we'll define an empty variable $name and we'll echo $name. Okay, so let's verify this first, then we'll go around in the topic. Okay, there's nothing on the output because the variable is empty. Okay, now let's use that method. Okay, so let's use the method isSet $name, and we're going to use ternary operator, which we haven't discussed yet. Again, this will be discussed in the operator section. I'm going a step ahead, but it's a very simple syntax wherein you have a condition here, you put a question mark, then there is a true colon false. Okay, if this condition is true, this will be printed. If this condition is false, this will be printed. So what we'll say, variable is set if isSet, or we will say variable is not set. Okay, using a ternary operator here which says this value is printed true when this condition is true, when this value is printed when it is false. Okay, so let's look into that. So say variable is not set. Now we will set the variable. And we'll try to use the same ternary operator to see what it says. Okay, now it says variable is set. So that's the use of this method. It's very simple and straightforward. It checks whether that variable is set or not. You can even do that if you have a variable of a variable, means you have a first name, let's say test, then you have a name which is pointing to first name, and you want to verify whether the name variable is set or not, and this name variable is pointing to another variable, right? Let's verify that. So variable is set. Okay, so what if this value is not set? Will it be set? Because name is already set to first name, but first name is not set. So what do you think is the output? Any guesses? Right, the variable is not set because you haven't set the variable, and if you turn it back, the variable is set. Okay, so that's how the isSet will work. It will even check the variable, and it's also references whether even that variable has some value or not. Okay, so this is a very important method. Make sure you work some exercises around it and do this same hands-on without even seeing this code, and try to play around with isSet. Okay, the main purpose of isSet is to check whether the variable has some value or not. Okay, so that's all about this isSet in this lecture, and I'm going to see you in the next one. Welcome to the lecture on recap all the variable concepts. So in this lecture, we're going to recap all the concepts that we have seen in one program. So this way you remember all the concepts, and if you want to refer back to the variable concepts, you can go to this lecture directly. Okay, so in the logical flow and the deliverables, we'll have one file to be created as deliverable, variable concepts.php, and we'll recall all the variable concepts one by one. Okay, so let's go ahead and create this file. So first we learn how to define a variable. Okay, we say name is equal to John Smith, and we use a $sign to define a variable. And we learn variables can be used as string and integer. Means you can define message as 1, you can define message as PHP the best. You can echo the message, and you can use a dot operator to separate the text. Then we looked at double quote and single quote. So print variables with double quotes. So we used echo. And convert it into single quotes. I won't print the variable. Next, we learned about variable typing. This is basically converting the string to integer. And vice versa. Okay, so let's look at that example. So we have a variable length. Let's make this as a string. So this is a typing wherein we are multiplying a string with an integer, and then the conversion of string to integer is taken care by PHP. Then we looked about variable is case sensitive. So if you define one more name, Walter White, and then we print it. Then we will see two values, one from the lowercase n and one from the uppercase n. Then we looked at variable scope. Right, we had a counter is equal to 1. Then we defined a function show counter. Then we see counter is equal to 2, and then we echo the counter value. Then we had show counter, then we have counter. Yes. Okay, this will help you to understand what is the scope of the counter inside and outside the function. Then we saw global variables. Okay, it's the same example. I say global, I say count. So even though you define as a global variable as count, you can still not access it. You have to say global $count, and then now when you assign the value, it's going to refer back to the global variable. Then we looked about static variable. We had counter static method. We have a static variable, and then we print the count. And then we will increment the count. Okay, and then we'll call this method. That will print all the count in sequence. Then we talked about predefined variables. You can say print global variables, and we can use the super global variable echo dollar count. The global variable is count here. You can use that. Then we also looked about variable of variables. Count of count is equal to, let's say, count okay, and you want to print the count of count. This will print the count value, okay, which is nothing but the count value that you have defined previously, this count value. Okay, so you are accessing this variable via this variable. Okay, and then we looked at isEt function. So you can say isEt $$ count of count. Okay, so let's execute this file. So we hit into one error, and that's saying unexpected, line number 35. Obviously we have to define the counter variable first, and then we have to assign the value to the global variable, right? So that solves the problem. So let's review one by one. So we have a name variable, and we have the integer and string, and we printed the message. Then the message variable was previously integer, then it became string. Then we printed the two variables with double quotes and single quotes. So first time we saw the variable value, second time we saw the variable name itself. Then we have variable typing, string to integer multiplication works fine, and we see the variable case sensitivity, wherein we have two different variables having the same name and different case. Then you have scoping. Then you can see the counter value 2 and then the 1. Okay, Then you have global variable, that's basically your counter 1, then the counter 2, that's why you're able to see 2 here, right? Then you had static variable, we can print this 3 times just to see the output, 1 2 3, right? And then you are able to access the global variable 2 with the predefined variable and count of count, which is nothing but variable of variables. You are able to access that too. So we haven't printed this, so let's print this also as well so that we can see this value, right? So we should see 1 more 3 here. So that's basically accessing the global variable, and then we are trying to access the count. So count is a local variable, count, this one is a global variable. Okay, so that's why you see 2 values. And then variable is set, yes, the variable is set, that's why we are able to see the value. All right, the output is not much important, but you have to understand how to use them, right? What we try to learn in this section and how to use these concepts when you write PHP program. And you have to understand like variable typing, variables of variable, global variables, predefined variables, all these concepts you have to have some hands-on and you have to understand how it works. Okay, so that's all for this lecture, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on constants. So let's look at the material folder, variable and constants, and example 16 constants. Let's look at what we will learn in this lecture. Okay, so part of this we will understand how to define and use constant. Then we'll try to change the value of a constant and see if you change a value of a constant what will happen. We'll use the same name as variable and constants to see whether it's able to differentiate between variable name and a constant name with the same name. Then we'll understand some of the naming rules of constants. Then we'll use the method isSet method, which we use for variables. And part of this we will create all these files. Okay, so first, what is constant? Constant is basically a value which doesn't change across your program. If you want to define a value that's basically holding up some string or integer and you don't want to change that value in your overall program, then you define a constant. Whereas variable will change the values, constant doesn't change the value. That's all this difference is. So part of this, if you go to www folder, so we have done with variables, so let's go ahead and create a folder called constants. Okay, so let's open our Sublime, then let's start creating our first program. Control N, Control S, and I'm going to change the folder to constants. Okay, let me open my browser. Okay, the browser is here. Okay, so let's define a constant. So I'll say define constant, and this is going to be our sample one. To define a constant, you need a function that is called as define. Define has 2 parameters. The first one is basically the name of the constant, and next one is the value of the constant, right? That's how you basically define a constant. So let's define one constant, and the good practice is basically whenever you define a constant, make it uppercase. Okay, so let's define a constant called language and give a value of PHP. Okay, now let's see how to print this. Okay, before printing we can even do this. Okay, how do you assign a constant to a variable? So you just, how do you assign a constant to a variable? So you'll say language, and if you look at it here, we are not using any $sign here. Okay, if you use a $sign, it becomes a variable. Whatever value that you give here mostly should be uppercase, just to define it's a constant. That value you can directly use as a normal English, right? There's no special characters in front to make it understand it's a constant. Okay, so let's try to print this. So let's say echo I'm going to increase this length so that you can see the program. This program is written using, then I'll call the variable first. Okay, let's call the variable first so that we know how to differentiate between variables and constants. So I'm going to copy this. This time let me call language here, and then what I'll say, okay, so I want to call it outside. So now the question here is whether it's a string or it's a constant. How does the PHP understand this? Because you're not assigning any dollar value here, and without a dollar value, is it considered as a string, like a normal string, or is it considered as a language, which is nothing but a constant? And here it's very straightforward because it's outside the string interpolation. So here it should be able to understand it's a constant. Let's print this and let's understand how this works. Constants, let's open our file name. Okay, and if you see here, the first one was the variable. The second one, it was not able to identify it's a constant, so it treated this one as a string. So remember that there's no string interpolation for constant, right? Don't do that. If you have to define or print a constant, you have to do it outside your strings. Okay, for the first one, it's good to see the first one was able to interpolate, right? It was able to convert or change the value of the lang to the actual value of the lang. But in the second line, the same double quotes is unable to recognize a constant. So you have to remember this. Someone will ask you this: if you define this and you print this, whether the language is going to print PHP or the string is going to print a string. So every time you define it outside your strings. Okay, so that was the first example, and let's do a second example where we'll try to change the value of a constant. So copy this, copy the file name, Control N, Control S, and paste it here. Right, so I'll call it sample2. So let's redefine, means change the value of a constant. I'm gonna say same language. This time I'm gonna say Java. Right, I'm trying to change a constant, and if you have worked with constants before, you should not be changing a value of a constant, right? So let's look at what happens if you change a value of a constant. So let's print this, and we'll see the same echo here. And can you make a guess what will happen? Is it gonna print PHP or is it gonna print Java? Make a guess. So in the meantime, I'll execute this. Okay, it's gonna print PHP. It doesn't care how many times you will change it after it is defined. It still holds the value of the first definition, right? You try to change the value, it still holds PHP. That's basically the constant. Constant doesn't change value. That's why it's called as constant. Okay, so let's look at the third example. The third example is same name with variable and constant. So let's look at this. Sample 3. This time I'll say language as a variable, right? And let's see what happens if I do this. And I'll try to do print the constant and print the variable and the constant. So is it going to be differentiating, or it will error out saying that, oh, language constant is already defined, now you cannot define a variable? Okay, so let's verify that. Is it gonna check that, or is it gonna ignore that? Well, it's gonna ignore that. It doesn't really care what name you give to the constant and what name you give to the variable. Even though the names are same, it doesn't really matter. It's able to differentiate that. Okay, so let's look at the fourth example. We'll look at one of the naming rules. and most of the naming rules will tie back to what we have seen in the variables. It's all gonna be same. Let's look at one of the constant naming convention. So let me define, we know the variable should not start with an integer, so let's define one, say version, right, and we say 7.3, then we say echo one version. Okay, so let's execute this. This is number 4 and it's an error. It's an error because you cannot have constant name starting with an integer. Okay, if you remove this, it should work fine. Okay, so I'm going to leave the sample here. I'm going to comment this out. The last one will use the eSet method to see whether the value is set for constant or not. Okay, so I'm going to copy this. So we're going to look sample 5 and I'm going to define a name, and this time I will not assign any value to it, just to check whether the eSet method works or not for constant. So I'll say echo eSet of name, and I'll say echo name. So let's execute this program and see whether you can use eSet for constant. Okay, if you execute 5, no, you cannot use eSet for a constant. So remember this, if you want to verify a constant is empty, you cannot use eSet. Okay, the last one I want to add it here is how to access constant using the constant method. There's a method called constant, and we can say constant, and we can say name. So I want to call this name. Okay, let's comment this out. Obviously you can say echo, right? If we haven't set any name, we can use language and print it. And here's your language. All right, so let's do a quick review. So for sample 1, we understood how to define a constant. We assign it to a variable, and remember that you cannot print a constant inside the double quotes, it has to be outside. You can have same name, then you cannot, second sample we saw you cannot change a constant is unchangeable. When you try to change it, it doesn't error out, but it doesn't change the value. Sample 3, we created the same variable name as a constant, and it doesn't really care whether you have the same name or not. Then fourth, we saw the naming convention. Sample 5, we saw whether we can use eSet method to check whether a name constant is empty or not. Then we try to use a method called constant to access a constant. Okay, well, that's all for this constant lecture, and I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the lecture on variable versus constant. So by now we know what is variable and what is constant. So let's do a comparison between the two, and let's try to understand if you have to define a variable or a constant, or you have to differentiate, what is the difference between both of the two. So this lecture will help you understand that. So I'm in the materials, variable and constant, example 17, variable versus constant. Let's look at the deliverables and also the logical flow. So there's only one file we'll create. We'll understand what is the difference between variable and constant. Okay, let me quickly create this file. Okay, so let's first understand what were the differences we have seen so far. So for this, I'll create a simple documentation for us to type. The first one we saw is no need to use $sign to use the constant, right? We use a method called define to define the constant, not a dollar sign. So constants are defined only via the define method, right? We even saw this. Value can be assigned only once. Okay, that's for constant. And constant has global scope. We haven't seen this, we'll see it now. And can access anywhere. And constant method can be used to access the constants. That's we have seen. We will see the global scope now, and also we'll see some of the differences. So we say name is equal to John Smith. We're defining a variable here. And we'll define a name. And we'll say echo $name dot, right? So it's very good example for you to summarize most of the points. First is, how do you define a constant? You use define. How do you define a variable? You use $sign. How do you assign a value to one variable? You use an assignment operator. And how do you assign a value to a constant? You use a method called define. How to print them? For variable you use $sign. For constant you just specify the name of it. Okay, so let's try to change it. Able to change variable but not constant. Let's try this out once more time. That's basically the major difference between constant and the variables. Right, so let's run this file. Localhost right. So you see the Walter void is basically coming up from the variable that is changed, but the constant, even we try to change, doesn't change. Well, that's the difference between variable and constants. Let's look at the global scope. So let's say I write a function print constant, very simple, and I use the echo to print the variable and a constant, and I'm going to call this, and let's see which one is going to print out. And remember, $name has a local scope. So you see only John Smith is printed. So let's do a break here. Right, so you see only the constant is printed but not the variable. That's basically the name constant has a global scope. You can call it from anywhere. You can even do this constant name, right? It works fine. So you can use the method as well to call the constant, or you can use a constant name as it is. Well, that's all for this differences between variable and constant, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Welcome to the lecture on valid versus invalid constant. So we'll see some valid constants and we'll see some of the invalid constants. So part of this lecture we will create one file, and remember that after you finish this you can go ahead and look at this file as well. So part of this we'll see some good practices as well, and we'll also list out the valid and invalid constants. I'm going to save this file. So first let's look at some good practice. Okay, good practice number one: always Any guess? Well, always use uppercase. Right? So that's easy to differentiate, because if you have a same variable name and same constant, just by looking at the case, we know is a constant or it's a variable. Obviously, you know from the $sign as well, but you know, the good practice point of view, always define your constant as an uppercase. Well, that's a good practice. Then we'll look at the good practice 2. Do not use constants like this, like underscore constants underscore. Well, underscore actually have a different meaning in PHP, and we have seen previously in variable the super global variables and some predefined variables, right, which are starting with underscore. So don't get confused and don't write your own constants with underscore. That's not a good practice. Always define it as a simple constant like this. Okay, don't use like underscore and constant. Well, that's a bad practice. Okay, so I'll show you an example. Don't define like this. This is a wrong practice, right? Let's look at good practice number 3. Avoid this. We have seen previously, same name as variable. Okay, so we've seen this previously. I'm just going to type it faster. Okay, make sure you don't use same names. The last good practice is use the same naming convention. Okay, the naming convention was, don't define, one naming convention is do not start variable or constant name with integers. Obviously it will error out, but remember this, a good practice, right? Don't try to define it. So you can, don't do this. Let me show you what I mean by that. So if you're defining, let's say, a message, okay, you don't do like this. You can always print this, and don't follow this for your constants as well. Okay, not a good practice. I'm going to remove the $sign. Right, so let's print this and let's verify this file. Right, how many echoes we have? We have 2 echoes, or just we have 1 echo. That echo is coming up from variable and a constant. Obviously the point I want to make here is don't start with integer. Doesn't look good, and sometimes someone say, okay, I don't want an integer, it becomes an error, right? So don't follow this practice. Okay, if possible, don't start with underscore as well, right? So those are the good practices for defining and constant. Remember this and use it in your programming style as well. Okay, so that's all for this lecture. I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the lecture on magic constant. So we have seen super global variables, we have predefined variables. So let's look at magic constants. So if you go to example 19, magic constants, let's look at what we're going to do here. We're going to learn about magic constant and we're going to create this file. Okay, so before that, head back to PHP manual and let's look at magic constant. So these are predefined constant. One good example is the line, and basically the file name, and then you have the directory path. Okay, these are the variables already available in PHP. You don't have to do anything, you don't have to include anything, just start using it. Okay, and if you see the notation, it's underscore underscore. So that's why the one good reason is never define your variables, never define your constants using underscore, because it will confuse between magic constants or super global variables across with your normal custom variable names and constant names. Let's use this in our program and write a simple program using magical constants. I'm going to quickly save this file. Let me go back to my amps folder, www constants, and I'm going to save it here. Okay, so before that I'll copy this manual link here so that you can refer this when you write this program. Let's try to print some magic constant. So I'll print a line. Then I'm gonna print the file. Okay, so let's print this. So you have the fully qualified file name with the directory path, and then you have this line number, right? This is the line number, number 5. If you move down to, let's say 10, then you have 10 here, right? That's basically the line number. Okay, it's super helpful when you want to do a tracing and you want to see at which line you are writing some complex code and you want to debug that line, right? Then you know, or else you are writing an like 1,000 lines of program and you want to have a checkpoint for every 30th line, right? Wherein you are saying, okay, the first logic is done, second logic is done, third logic is done. You can use this line to say, okay, on this line, this is basically I've reached to this line. Then it will say, okay, I've reached to next 20, then next 30. So it will help you out to trace as well. So remember this link given you in this program as well. Go and do some R&D here and try to print directory and play around with functions and try to get used to this magic constant. Okay, so that's all for this lecture, and I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the lecture, and we're going to recap all the constant concepts that we have seen. Okay, so part of this lecture, we're going to create one deliverable, and basically we'll recap all the constant concepts. So let me save this file, and let's look at the concepts that we have seen so far in constant. I'm going to do a real quick here because we have seen this previously. So define constant, how do you do it? And treat this as your exam, right? Because once you learn this concept and someone say, okay, how do you define a constant? You should be pretty much writing it without saying it. This is how you define a constant. Do not redefine the constant. So do not again say define language as Java. It's not going to change, so it's no use redefining it. Do not use variable and constant. Names, I've seen that. I'm going to do very quick here. If you want to use a constant inside a string, how you're going to do it? Think for a second, because you cannot print constant inside a string. But let's say you have to do it because you have a long string and somewhere in the text it says, oh, hello, and then you have to print a name, and that name is a constant. Imagine for a second. And then how do you going to print a constant inside a string? It could be an interview question. So think for a second how you're going to do it. That's your answer. Well, you'll assign it to a variable and you'll print it. Define a magic constant. Right, so let's print this. So first we print the name and a constant, that's basically this. Then we print this is a language, that's basically coming up from PHP, and then we print the line. I hope you understand how to define a constant and what is the difference between a constant and a variable and how to use this constant. Okay, so that's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on exercise on create and display variables. So let's look at what I want you to do as an exercise. Okay, this exercise, don't skip it. If you skip it, you will not understand how to write variables, because understanding a concept is different and writing and practicing is different. So make sure you always practice it so that you understand the concept very well. Okay, this is a file name and we will check the exercise one variable before the PHP file for the topics. So the exercises are listed in this file. So let's open the before and after file. After is after you complete, you can compare it with the after folder. Before you start, you use this file. So let's open this file. So here are the exercises. So first we'll say define a string variable, integer variable, print variable from a function. Then you define a static variable, global variable, super global variable, and variables of variables. Okay, so let's look at this file. Okay, and the output file is basically the exercise one variable. So let's create this file and we'll save it in the www folder. Amps. So there will be an exercise folder. I'm going to dump it here. Okay, and we're going to copy this and we're going to paste this here. So what I want to do is I want you to write the string variable, integer variable, print variable from function, and do all these steps. Okay, once you are done, you can share it with me and then I'll give you my comments there. And if you're stuck and you don't know some of the things, then you can go back to after folder and then you can verify with this file. So pause this video here and finish your exercise. Alright, so I'll show you how to do this exercise as well. So let me close the before folder. So first is create and display a variable. Okay, so let's quickly do that. So that's how basically you create and you display a variable. Next we'll print the string variable. So we already defined that variable, so we're going to print that. Okay, then we're going to print integer variables. So that's basically our integer variable. Let's print a variable from function. Okay, so that's a function that will print the counter variable. Next, define a static variable. Okay, so static is the keyword used to define static variable. Let's define a global variable. So we use global keyword to define our global variables. Then we can use super global variables to print our global variables. So we already did that. Then you print variables of variables. Okay, that's basically a variable of variable. So before we run that, I think there's one PHP missing here. Let's close this inside the PHP. Put a semicolon here. All right, so here we have to put it a flower bracket so that it understands this is a variable again. If you don't do it, then it will take this $sign as text. Okay, so we are saying this is basically a variable, and then we want a $sign out of it. All right, so let's print this now. Okay, so let's quickly verify. We have created and display and variable. We have a string variable, then we have an integer variable, then we have print variable from the function, then we have define a static variable, then we have global variables, right? Then we have super global variable, which is nothing but this. Then we have variables of variables. So variables of variables is this one. Okay, and if you want a double quote, then you basically can do this. Then you can remove the flower brackets here. So yeah, even it's gonna print the same output. Okay, so that's basically the exercise, and I hope you also did the same exercise. If you haven't done it, I highly recommend go back and do this exercise. Okay, so that's all for this lecture. I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the lecture on exercise 2, define and display constants. Well, I want you to do this exercise on how to define and display constants. So open this folder. Let's look at the deliverables. So you'll create one exercise file and you have to check this for the instruction. So I'll open this before folder, open this file, and let's print this file first to see what is the output. So I'm going to place this file in the exercise folder. Okay, so let's see this file first. Then you can see the instructions. Exercise 2. So we'll define and display a constant, a string constants, integer constant, print constant from function, then we'll display magic constant. Well, do this exercise, pause this video here, and then you'll come back here if you have any questions. Alright, so let's do this exercise. So I'm going to copy paste this one into a new file. I'm going to go to amps folder, www exercise, and paste it here, right? And I'm going to copy paste from the before file into this one. Call this exercise 2. And close that. So let's quickly define constant. Well, we have defined a constant and we have printed the constant. Let's do a string constant which is already defined. Then we'll do an integer constant. Then we are calling the method which is printing the constant. Then we have integer constant and we have string constant, and we have define and display the constant. So let's see this exercise. I want to access that file. Okay, so first is exercise with constant. That's what the program info is. Then we print the string, and then we have an integer constant, right? Then we have print constant from a function. We have used this echo to print it, and constant has global scope, so it's able to access from function as well. Then you have display a magic constant, which is the line number. So if you're on the line number 39, you will see 39 here. Okay, so that's all the exercise for constants, and that's all for this lecture. I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the assignment section on variable and constants. So do this practical test. Open up the material and practical test, and you should be able to find this assignment file. And the assignment is basically to do this without seeing anything, right? It's like a practical test, and you have went to an interview and someone asked you to do this exercises and show it as an output. So try in that way. And if you have to do and practice, go back to all the exercises and lecture and do it there. When you come to assignment, do it without saying it. Okay, so let's look at what is the assignment. First, you will define and assign two variables, first name and last name variable with your name. Then you will print the first name and last name using echo or print. Then you will embed the variable inside the quotes. You can choose single or double quotes, and you should know the difference. Then define a function to print the name. Okay. Then you show the variables are case sensitive, prove this. Then you create a local variable outside the function and define the same variable inside the function and display the variable. Then you define and show the global variables and also the static variables, and then show a super global variable and also show variables of variables. Then you use a ESET method for ternary operator. 12th, define and display a constant and show magic constant. Well, all the best for the assignment. Do this assignment, and if you have any questions, you can post in the Q&A section. Alright, that's all for this lecture, and I'll see you in the next one. Let's summarize what you have learned in this section. So by now, you should be able to define your own variables and constants. You should know how to work with string, integer data type, and function. Remember, this is not the full section on data types and function. We have a separate section to cover on that. But on a high level, you should be able to define string, assign an integer value to a variable, and you should be able to write a function and call it. You should know the difference between variable and constant and when to use any of these two. And you should understand these various concepts of the variables that we have seen in this section. And I highly recommend that if you have not done exercises and you have not attended any of the questions, go back, do this exercise, take the interview questions, and even do the practical test. This will all help you to learn PHP faster, because without even trying out the examples, it's really hard to do and learn PHP. Okay, so that's all for this section, and I'll see you in the next one.